In this video, I'm going to talk more about the 19th century, and I'm going to talk a little more about nationalism. So in the last video, I talked about colonialism. I talked about kind of the implications of the Industrial Revolution on a more global scale, and talked about the ways Europe is exporting its new economic model, but also its some of its political ideologies. And the most dominant political ideology that's emerging in Europe after the Napoleonic Wars is the ideology of nationalism. And what does this mean? I've included a couple of videos this week to help you kind of get a grip of the question that people are wrestling with at this time, these questions of nationalism. But basically, it's the idea that people of the same nationality should all be ruled together. So in the past, you were ruled by individuals. You had a relationship with an individual ruler. And that was what was more important, rather than being part of a big nation. And as we get into the 19th century, after the French Revolution and after Napoleon exports a lot of these ideas across Europe, there's this idea that everyone who shares the same culture should be governed under the same political system. Now, how you define what a nation is going to raise a lot of very difficult questions. And I hope that the videos kind of shed light on that a little bit. Does it mean that everyone is Italian who speaks Italian? If someone lives in the geographic area of Italy but doesn't speak Italian, should they be part of a different nation state? And the same questions are being asked all around the world. So that kind of gives you an insight into what nationalism is and why it's kind of complex. So it's this idea that everyone who shares the same, really, I suppose you would say the same ethnicity, and the same language and the same culture, however those are defined, should be part of one political state and have one political ruler. Now, that's nationalism. Underpinning that in Europe, so nationalism is the dominant political ideology in Europe in the 19th century. Underpinning that in Europe are conservatism and liberalism. Now, all these terms, nationalism, conservatism, and liberalism, they are all 19th century terms. People often want to use these terms to talk about things that happened before the 19th century, but that's actually inaccurate. Strictly speaking, all these terms, all these different political terms, come from the 19th century. Conservatism is the fallout from the French Revolution. It's from people who recognize that there's a problem with absolutism. And they accept a lot of the ideas of the Enlightenment, but they say if you accept all the ideas of the Enlightenment and try and implement them all, you get the violence and the chaos of the French Revolution. We don't want that. So we want to have a monarchy, we want to have some kind of social hierarchy, but we want people to have individual rights. On the other end, you have liberals who say this concern about chaos and violence that we see on the part of conservatives, it's misplaced. It's a focus on society when we should be focusing on individuals. If we give individuals the freedoms that the Enlightenment calls for, then we won't have to worry about chaos, that things will work out. But both of these political movements will support nationalism. The conservatives because it provides order, and the liberals because it's a way of establishing the social contract between everyone who's of the same nation. That's kind of at the bedrock of liberalism. It's a little bit difficult to explain, but what you need to take away from this is conservative approach to society and government, the liberal approach to society and government, and how they both see nationalism as supporting that. And so we're going to see nationalism used to create large nation states all across the world. First of all, in the United States. Now, this isn't a US history class, so I'm not going to go into this in detail. But it's important to recognize that during the 19th century, the United States very successfully set itself up to become the superpower of the 20th century. And first of all, that's through geographic expansion, control of the Ohio Valley, the Louisiana Purchase, control of Texas and California. So the United States becomes much bigger and then fights a civil war for the way that this new country is going to be modeled. And part of that is certainly about slavery, but part of it also is connected to this global dynamic of nationalism that I'm trying to get at here. Part of this is connected to the idea that there should be a union, and that the union is what's most important. Not that you have individual states that are a part of this union, but that you have a union that's subdivided into different states. It's a slightly different approach, but this idea of everyone being grouped into one union is very similar to the ideas of nationalism that we see elsewhere in the world. The other part of nationalism, or the other part of the creation of the nation state that I want to emphasize, is again industry and the legacy of the Industrial Revolution. Part of the reason why the North wins the Civil War is that it's more industrialized. It has more people, it can transport them more quickly. And the growth of industry makes the creation of these large nation states possible. Makes it possible to have a large nation state instead of a local, smaller political entity with connections to an individual ruler. So that's the United States. That introduces industrialism. I want to talk about Latin America, and then I want to talk about Europe. In Latin America, when Napoleon invades and conquers Spain, the Spanish Empire in the New World finally falls apart. Spain had been in decline for a while. Napoleon invades Spain. He dethrones the Spanish monarchs, but then there's guerrilla war. Spain, the New World, so far away from Spain, it's impossible to maintain this empire. And so we see the different countries of Latin America breaking away. And this continues even after Napoleon is defeated and the Spanish kings are brought back. This continues for a couple of reasons. And this plays into what I was saying earlier about how liberals and conservatives both will support nationalism. Conservatives in Latin America find that the representatives of the Spanish kings, when they return after being restored by Napoleon, are promoting a lot of Enlightenment ideas that they don't like. And so you find conservatives who are trying to promote independence from Spain and the creation of new Latin American nations. At the same time, you also have liberals who reject the idea of having a monarch at all and want to have republics. And so they're going to promote the independence and the creation of new Latin American nations. And we're going to see this in South America and in Central America, and also we're going to see this in Brazil. Brazil a little different because it's connected with Portugal, but we see this same dynamic. The creation of nation states, the adoption of some of the ideas of the Enlightenment. Latin America remains a very conservative part of the world. And so some ideas of the Enlightenment, particularly the abolition of slavery, are a really important part of the creation of Latin American nations and independence from European colonial masters. But some aspects of the Enlightenment, such as removing a confessional religion and making religion private, that's something that Latin American nations are resistant to. So a lot of these Latin American nations, these new nations, still identify as confessionally Catholic and still call themselves Christian, even though they're adopting aspects of a republic, which in Europe is seen as something very secular. Okay. Last part of the world I'm going to touch on in this video is in Europe, where we find nationalism emerging in two places in particular, in Italy and Germany. They are the parts of Europe that still don't have nation states. We see an English nation state develop relatively quickly, partly because it's such a small island. We see a French nation state develop during the French Revolution. We see a Spanish nation state develop kind of early and definitely be present after the Napoleonic Wars. Germany and Italy are still divided into these different local regions that are influenced, in the case of Italy, still by Spain and by Austria. But nationalism changes that. Nationalism introduces and promotes this idea that all Italians should be part of one Italian state. Just pause for a moment and think about how new this is. We're talking about the United States after the Civil War. And there's still no nation of Italy, there's still no nation of Germany. But because of the reasons that I've outlined, because both liberals and conservatives find their interests supported in nationalism, we find that these movements continue to grow. We find that Italy unifies and manages to create independence from Spanish influence in the south and Austrian influence in the north. We find that that in Germany there are a series of wars that result in the creation of a German empire. Now, as in one of the videos that I've included for this week explains to you, there's a debate among German speakers. They think that they definitely should have a German nation state. And that's because they've seen the power of the French nation state when Napoleon conquered all of Germany. And they feel that they need something like that to defend themselves from these other powerful nation states. But there's a question about whether the power and the center of this German state should be focused in the north, around Prussia, or in the south, around Austria. And the answer at the end of these wars of German unification ends up being that it will be Prussia. It will be Prussia that will form this German nation state. That's for a couple of reasons. Firstly, again, industrialization. Industrialization is happening faster in Prussia than elsewhere in Germany. It provides the industrialized armies, it provides the railroads and the infrastructure to move those armies more quickly and more powerfully than in Austria. And the Prussians are able to defeat the Danes, they're able to defeat the Austrians, and they're able to defeat the French in a series of wars that establishes a Prussian empire in Central Europe. So a large part of this is due to the Prussians' effective use of technology. The other part of their success is due to their efficient use of political strategy, a political strategy called realpolitik, that is very much intertwined with nationalism. That it says the goal of politics is to increase the power of your nation. It's not to pursue a particular ideology, a particular way in which you think your nation will become a better place to live necessarily. It's about pursuing an ideology that says, how can I make my nation more successful compared to the nations around it? And this ideology is willing to sanction some pretty unscrupulous behavior in the interest of promoting nationalism. And the Prussians are also successful at doing this. They're able to convince the Austrians to ally with them against the Danes. They're then able to convince the Italians and the French to unify with them against the Austrians. And then they're able to convince the Austrians to unify with them against the French. And each time they're able to somehow conceal their intentions from their allies who are about to become their enemies in order to pursue their agenda. And these German wars of unification end with the declaration of a new German empire, a new Prussian German empire in the Palace of Versailles. And this is the end of 19th century politics, the culmination of 19th century politics. And what is the culmination? The culmination is that the French are really bitter because this is a national humiliation for the Germans to declare victory in the Palace of Versailles. The second is that nation states are here to stay. They're much bigger political entities than we've had before, and wars with nation states are going to be much more destructive. And so this is the way in which the rise of the nation state in Europe sets the stage for the destructive wars of the 20th century. And I'll be back in next week to talk about the 20th century. Thank you.